Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this latest series of Brexit webinars for members. A few introductions first. I'm Chris Welsh. I'm FTA's Director of Global and European Policy. I will be chairing this particular webinar, and will take you through the subject matter and deal with any points as they arise during the webinar. Our aim today will be to update you on the latest developments, including the momentous decision earlier this week to hold a general election on the basis of the government wanting a stronger negotiating hand in its upcoming discussions with the EU, and also to tell you and keep you in the loop about what FTA is doing to help shape and influence the debate from a freight and logistics industry point of view, and importantly representing members' views on that. And I'm joined today by Pauline Bastidon. Pauline is Head of European Policy and based in our Brussels office and has key FTA responsibility at front-end delivery of FTA policy on this matter in Brussels. And there will be the opportunity to pose questions or place questions in the system, and I'll tell you a bit about that as we go on. So a few house rules so you know how we're managing the webinar. We would ask you to keep your microphone and your telephones muted, because that may impact on the quality of the recording. The webinar will be recorded, so anything that you miss or haven't fully understood, there'll be opportunity to go back over that. And the recording will be made available on the FTA website. We won't be able to deal with any technical issues during the webinar itself, which is going to take you through the whole process. But if you've got a question, as I said, there is a chat box option that you've got. So please place your any questions or points that you have in the chat box, and we'll either cover them right at the end of the webinar if there's time. But if not, we will come back to you on that with answers, in addition to placing the recording on the website. Okay, so the FTA is leading for logistics on the Brexit issue, and as a result of that, we are following the decision to leave the EU and how that will affect virtually every member area of our membership. And as a result of that, FTA has produced an ABC guide to Brexit and a Brexit manifesto. Again, they're all available on the FTA website. And as members, this is your opportunity to engage with us and join in the discussions about how we're going to shape our post-Brexit world for freight and logistics. In response to member concerns and interests, we have, for example, established a new customs working group that is already working to shape FTA policy in developing concrete proposals in terms of how we want to deal with customs matters. And in fact, we held a very lively session of the working group in London yesterday. So I'll outline later in the webinar how you can be involved and engaged at every level within the process, should you choose to do so. If not, then you can do that by the usual methods that FTA uses to communicate with members, through the website, through these webinars, through Freight Magazine, and our daily communications through press releases and other matters, and other areas that we can communicate with members. So you can find that on the FTA website. Just go to fta.co.uk/Brexit, and all the the details will be there. I'm now going to pass you over to Pauline Bastidon, who will take you through the Brexit Manifesto. Over to you, Pauline.
Thank you, Chris. So a few months ago, we adopted basically 10 core recommendations for government for successful Brexit for logistics. This is our Brexit Manifesto, which will be all the more important now that we know that there will be general election fairly soon. The manifesto focuses on 3 core streams: Global Britain, how to make the most of new international opportunities; accessing the EU market post-Brexit; and last but not least, making the most of Brexit domestically to build a stronger Britain. And this manifesto has already been used extensively to develop contacts with officials and ministers across the various departments dealing with Brexit in the UK. And obviously we're using especially the EU part to talk to the EU 27 side, especially in Brussels. So I'm now going to hand over back to Chris for a quick presentation of the ABC guide to Brexit.
Thank you, Pauline. So as you'll see on your screen now, this is the ABC guide that we have developed. And as you can see, it's quite a comprehensive list. And I think that kind of reflects the very broad impacts on FTA members. And today we're going to be drawing out some 4 key areas. One is access to the single market. So you'll hear a bit more about that later. Also the border controls, which are of key concern to members, particularly those operating goods vehicles, mainly across the Dover Straits, but also to our shipper members that are moving their products, and the impact that's likely to have on supply chain. I touched earlier on the customs issues, and we'll give a bit more detail in terms of some of those issues as they are emerging right now. And we'll also go into the legal process for leaving, so that members are fully clear about what that process is, and therefore how you can engage and how FTA can engage in that process to ensure that our members are represented. As you can see, there are other areas of affecting our membership, so it's not just trade with the EU, it is the global impacts of that, and we've already explored that with our members that have got international supply chains, and we've been taking a lot of steps to bring both ends of the supply chain, so other countries at the other end of the supply chain are just as much interested about the impacts of Brexit as FTA members are at this end of the supply chain. And probably another key area is ongoing policies to improve global connectivity. So the role of Heathrow and why that's proved to be so important in terms of future investment in transport infrastructure. And that will be a key demand still in the FTA election manifesto. So a lot being covered, but we will cover 4 specific areas, and the first of those is access to the single market. So I'm going to hand you back now to Pauline.
Thank you, Chris. So yes, indeed, one of the key points that we've emphasized also in our manifesto is how to maintain the biggest possible access to the single market, knowing that post-Brexit the UK will most probably not be a member of the single market or in a customs union with the EU, but that government will seek maximum access to the single market. So based on these parameters, the best option and the target for government, as well as the EU 27 side now, seems to be to agree a free trade agreement at the point of exit. So what's at stake? Well, what's at stake is the future trade arrangements, of course, and the procedures. But also whether all the sectors will retain maximum access to the single market. Very often sectors like agriculture or fisheries, for instance, get excluded from free trade agreements. So this, of course, could have some consequences in the future. And of course, the degree of regulatory convergence is another important aspect that will be dealt with as part of this free trade agreement, as well as the mutual recognition of product standards. The default option, and that's also what happens if there is no deal at the end of the 2-year process, is trade under WTO rules. That means no preferential access compared to what any other WTO member might get. So work is already underway to establish the UK's own schedules covering trade in goods and services at the WTO. And we understand that government aims to establish our schedules in a way that replicates, as far as possible, our current position as an EU member state. There are, unfortunately, some risks with the WTO option. That is, for instance, if there is no deal. Tariffs are, of course, one of these risks, and I will come back to that in a minute. What will be the customs procedures? There might not be any time to adapt if there is no deal. And will UK products still be recognized as equivalent to EU products? So many questions, and for this reason, we've said several times to government, to officials, that we feel that no deal would be the worst case scenario, basically. And we're very much hoping that both parties will work towards a very ambitious and thorough free trade agreement that will allow the UK and the EU to keep trading in the best possible way. Brexit. Next, please. One thing which is, of course, very important to our members is to make sure there are no barriers to trade with the EU. That's an essential part of the manifesto, and it's a message we're also spreading very strongly in Brussels to make sure that the EU27 side is well aware of this. We want seamless trades with minimum red tape, preferably at no additional costs. We don't want to see any tariffs or quotas for trade with the EU. So just to give you some examples of banned average tariffs registered by the EU for goods for most favored nations, so that's basically other WTO members that do not have a preferential agreement with the EU. The tariffs would be 35.5% for dairy products, 15.7% for cereals and other preparations, 6% for tea and coffee, more than 20% for sugar and confectionery, 19% for beverages or tobacco, more than 11% for clothing, and so on and so on. So obviously quite significant, and we want to avoid that. But let's not forget non-tariff barriers, which can be just as important, if not more costly, in fact, than the tariffs themselves. And these include administrative formalities, trade barriers, or regulatory barriers to trade. And I'll give you a few more examples of that. So our message really to both government and the EU27 side is that trade with the EU should be as seamless as possible. Next, please. I thought it might be useful at this point to go through various examples of non-tariff barriers. So these are taken from a UN document. It's the International Classification of Non-Tariff Measures from 2012. Basically, they fall into 3 groups. Technical measures, such as, for instance, the sanitary or phytosanitary measures, things you'd have to undertake if you have fresh produce, for instance. Veterinary measures would also fall in that category. You have technical barriers to trade as well, labeling, conformity assessments, as well as pre-shipment inspections and other formalities. There are non-technical measures as well, such as the rules of origin. That's a rule that applies when basically the EU wants to make sure that products really come from where they are supposed to come, and that, for instance, in the future you don't have Chinese products that use the UK as an entry point in the EU to avoid paying the tariffs they would otherwise have to pay. And there's a bit of red tape involved. You might have some procurement restrictions as well, for instance, and some export-related measures like taxes, quotas, and so on. So as you can see, all of this could be quite painful, and it will be really a top priority for us to make sure that all of this is as reduced as possible, and that we have basically a frictionless trade relationship between the EU and the UK. Moving on, another important point in our ABC guide, and an important point that we're always pushing across when we talk to government, is also the issue of borders. So of course that's the border with the Republic of Ireland, but that's also the border with France, Dover-Calais. At the moment we have juxtaposed controls, meaning that effectively the UK border from an immigration point of view is in Calais, on French territory. But there have been calls for renegotiations of the Le Touquet agreement in France. And that worries us a bit because of the restricted space in the UK, which means that service frequency could end up being limited. So obviously we're monitoring that very carefully. We're also aware of the fact that delays resulting from customs checks could have similar negative impact, not worse. We are modeling the cost and impact this could have, and as first result of this modeling exercise, we came up with a figure of £3.21 per truck per extra minute of delay. And it's quite critical when you have a figure like that to make sure that the extra minute of delay are as limited as possible. We understand, in fact, that the Port of Dover was assessing that 4 to 5 minutes would be needed on average for customs checks. That could create big queues, extra delays. So our goal will be to ensure that checks are not done within the port premises and that modern technologies are used to reduce delays and red tape. And that actually provides a good transition to customs that Chris Welsh will focus on.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Pauline. Yeah, this is a key area, and as I said earlier, the FTA has recently established a new customs working group to guide us in this area and get practical expertise from industry practitioners. And we're also working with a wide range of other trade organisations which share a similar position to FTA. So that we can develop a broad industry coalition for dealing with this issue. I mean, quite critically, the Prime Minister has made it clear that the UK will leave the customs union and will leave the single market. Now that raises all sorts of questions about what kind of customs regime that we are going to have, as Pauline indicated earlier, whether that means we will work under WTO rules and World Customs Organization arrangements, tariff arrangements, but also what will the future actual customs code look like? Well, we know that with the Great Repeal Bill, that the government is going to put all EU legislation into this repeal bill, and it will stay in place for a period of time. So that means that the Union Customs Code will remain in place until the government decides either to repeal that or sticks with it. But we are really already very concerned as FTA because we will need to know what the tariff will be and how the procedures will work. So we are working on that hard with the customs working group. The government has made it clear, and the Prime Minister has made it clear, that they want trade to be frictionless with the EU. Now, the government's definition of frictionless may be slightly different to what industry's definition of frictionless is, because if we leave the customs union, there will be arrangements that we will not be able to take advantage of unless we are able to negotiate that within a free trade agreement. And clearly that is the government's objective, and that is our objective, to ensure that that happens. But we are looking, there are various scenarios about what frictionless is, and we are clearly working on defining that. And we, at the moment, defining that as no friction at all. In other words, things remain as they are. What would some intermediate level be of low friction mean, or indeed what high friction would mean? And high friction is some of the issues that Pauline has just raised, for example, were delays at borders and non-tariff trade barriers and those kind of things, and they would impose heavy burdens on industry and cost. I think where our customs working group is getting together is a realisation perhaps that no friction is going to be very, very difficult to maintain unless our government is very effective in negotiating an equivalent free trade agreement to that we currently have, which means we're probably looking at a low friction scenario where we make it as easy as possible for UK businesses and our trading partners to work with us closely on that. And that's work that we have already started. We are liaising with our sister trade associations in Belgium, in the Netherlands, France, and Scandinavian countries, because they are equally concerned, because procedures that are in place in the UK would need to be reciprocated elsewhere in the EU, so it will have an effect on how customs is treated, not only in the UK but in other EU countries. And outside of the European Union, we're looking at how we can develop new trade deals, shipper trade deals, and you'll hear more about the outcome of the FTA Keep Britain Trading Conference, which we held last month, where we invited again our sister shipper organisations from Sri Lanka, Canada, Australia, other Commonwealth countries to talk about how we could define the kind of trade deal that was necessary in order to reduce costs and increase trade with the rest of the world. So FTA is not working on its own in this area. We are working with key trade experts, working in academia and with industry, to look at what the implications of the various trade deals are at the moment. And as we develop that, then we will use that to negotiate with government the kind of criteria and arrangements which we believe are necessary to achieve as no friction, yes, but realistically perhaps low friction to keep business trading. So that's heavily influencing, therefore, the what we're calling the Clean Brexit agenda. So that is, we have to have appropriate IT systems. We have something like an additional 300 million customs declarations that will need to be made for UK-EU trade. So whilst government is giving assurances at the moment, the existing chief system and its successor, computerized system, will be capable of handling those additional declarations, we're going to be pushing hard with government to ensure that they do have the necessary systems in place to deal with that. And that's an area that our customs working group is now going to be looking at very, very carefully. Also, an area we believe government may have underestimated is the level of industry learning on this issue, and that the level of training that will be necessary. I mentioned earlier the equivalent procedures in other EU customs administrations, and avoiding necessary vehicle checks. And the most important thing is no cliff edge. We just need transitional arrangements, if necessary, to take us over. And I think everybody now is realising to achieve low friction or frictionless trade, we're going to need transitional arrangements to ease us through what is a very complex process. So we're going to probably need to speed up a bit, Pauline, but over to you on the Article 50 process.
Thank you, Chris. So you can see that this chart on the Article 50 process is actually getting a little bit fuller as we get new dates. So basically, Article 50 was triggered on the 29th of March, which sort of starts the 2-year process. Now the European Council, minus the UK of course, needs to agree guidelines for EU negotiations, which it will do on the 29th of April, so very shortly. And then you have less than 2 years, in fact, because it started on the 29th of March, so until the 29th of March 2019 to negotiate the withdrawal agreement, bearing in mind that the detailed future relationship might not be decided at this stage. If a deal is reached, the UK lives and the new arrangements apply with a possible transition period. Free trade agreement is completed post-Brexit. If no deal is reached, the negotiations can be extended, but that requires unanimous approval from the EU27 side, so quite difficult. If no deal is reached, no extension is secured, EU treaties cease to apply, and trade-wise, the WTO rules apply until at least the UK has negotiated a free trade agreement. So that's the worst-case scenario I was talking about earlier. Next, please. So what's next? I thought it would be useful to review the concrete next steps in the coming weeks. So the Council will meet on the 29th of April to discuss guidelines for the negotiation. A draft of these guidelines has already been circulated in Brussels, so I will go through that in a moment. The Commission will then need to produce more detailed recommendations for Article 50 negotiating directives. There's a Commission meeting planned on the 3rd of May when they will discuss that, and it's expected that they will adopt them on the 22nd of May, as announced this week by the Commission spokesperson. Then, of course, and that was also announced this week, we have the UK general election on the 8th of June, which means that the likely start of the negotiations, focusing as a first step on the withdrawal arrangements, will probably not happen until mid-June. The likely start of the scoping exercise for the future relationship with the EU will not start immediately. Both sides need to make sufficient progress with the withdrawal arrangements to start discussing the future relationships. So our assessment is probably not before the end of this year or even early next year, which sounds probably more realistic. Next, please. On this slide, you've got a quick overview of the key players from the EU27 side. Of course, the member states themselves will play a very important role, but all their pictures couldn't fit in one slide. The European Council, with Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council, is basically in the lead on the negotiations, setting out guidelines for the negotiations, very important because that defines the timing, sequencing, and topics discussed and when they are discussed. He will delegate details of the negotiations to the European Commission and concludes the agreement with the UK with qualified majority once an agreement has been reached. The Council is also responsible for extending that period of negotiation unanimously if it feels there's a need for it. The European Commission has a dedicated Brexit task force with Michel Barnier, who's the chief negotiator for the EU. He's going to lead the detail of negotiations, but the services of the Commission, so the different DGs, will provide technical expertise and lead on trade negotiations. And not to be overlooked, the European Parliament and the sort of coordinator on Brexit there, Guy Verhofstadt, will also have an important role because they will need to provide their consent before the Council can actually conclude the agreement with the UK. So we've started establishing very good contacts with all of these key players, and I'm pleased to report that next week we'll have a meeting with the task force of Donald Tusk in the European Council, as well as the task force of Michel Barnier for the European Commission, and the people that will directly negotiate with the UK government and officials. Next, please. There will be 4 phases in the negotiations. If we look at the draft guidelines produced by the Council, which we are expecting to be adopted with minor changes. The first phase would be the withdrawal arrangements, that is to say the most pressing matters for an orderly withdrawal. So that's likely to start around mid-June, and it will focus on things like the financial settlement for the UK, the situation of EU citizens in the UK, and of course UK citizens in the EU. So quite important if you employ EU citizens in new companies. The specific situation of Ireland will also be discussed at that point, because the EU27 side and Michel Barnier recognized the fact that it is a very specific situation in Ireland because of the land border and the unique level of integration between the Republic of Ireland and the UK from a commercial point of view. And international agreements the UK has already signed up to while being a member of the EU will also be discussed at that point, such as international agreements on CO2 reduction. So we'll have already a bit more clarity on some pressing matters at that point in the negotiations. Once sufficient progress has been reached, the negotiations will then move on to the framework for the UK-EU future relationship. That second phase will only start when the EU27 side feels that sufficient progress has been reached. And we're assessing that that won't be before late 2017 or early 2018. The EU will only engage in preliminary and preparatory discussions on the framework for the future relationship at this stage. No trade agreement can be concluded while the UK is still a member of the EU, so this is worth bearing in mind. Transitional measures will also be very important. A transition period could indeed be foreseen once the main lines of the new framework have been defined. And this is something which is increasingly recognized by both sides in the negotiation. One option could be to retain the existing rules and processes until a new deal has been agreed, but that would imply accepting existing EU rules for a limited period of time, as well as jurisdiction from the European Court of Justice. One practical way of doing this could be for the UK to temporarily join EEA, like Norway. This is an idea being considered in Brussels at the moment, but we'll have to see whether that can gain any traction in the UK, especially in view of the forthcoming campaign. And last but not least, the comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU. That's something that will only be concluded post-Brexit, but is expected to cover a substantial part of UK-EU trade in goods and services. So won't be just a sectoral deal picking some sectors. The main features will have to be defined pre-Brexit, but the agreement itself, as I said, is only formally concluded after Brexit. It's expected to be a mixed agreement, which means that it will most probably require the approval of all the national parliaments and in some cases regional parliaments and entities as well. Moving on to the practical implications of Brexit. So just to sum it up, pre-Brexit, from a company perspective, expect no radical changes in terms of processes, rules, until the UK leaves the EU. All the rules and regulations that apply today will keep applying until the UK leaves, unless they are revised at EU level, of course. But pound fluctuations have already had some impact, of course, on importers and exporters. Post-Brexit, the extent of changes will very much depend on the UK deal with the EU. Hopefully we should have some more clarity as to the main features of this agreement pre-Brexit and have a good transition period to allow everyone, not least industry, to adapt to the new system. Low friction trade will be a priority for FTA, as mentioned previously. And I will now hand over to Chris for a recap of what FTA is doing for its members.
Thank you, Pauline. As I said earlier, we really do want members to engage with us, so we fully understand what their concerns are, what they're looking for in terms of a trade deal with the EU, how we can improve competitiveness, how we can expand our trade with the rest of the world, so please engage with us. You can do that through participation in these webinars. So any questions you've got, please post them, and we probably won't be able to deal with them today now because time is running out, but we will certainly get back to you. But more importantly, you can participate in FTA's democracy. So that's our regional freight councils, which cover all modes of transport, road, rail, and air. The British Shippers Council, which specifically deals with our external, mainly with our external trade outside of the EU. We're conducting various consultation surveys with members to get their views, and more detail on what FTA is doing to negotiate your position and where we are with the process will be undertaken at the upcoming Transport Manager seminars, which will start in September, and in these monthly webinars. Next slide, please. And we are continuing to widely engage with government on this. We're now developing we've developed our Brexit Manifesto. We've had our Keep Britain Trading event, where we had a Minister of State, Andrew Jones, talking at that event. So the government is already getting very close to FTA in terms of determining what the stakes are and what the freight and logistics industry needs. And that is extended to the wide range of Brexit committees and working groups that the Department for International Trade, DEXU, Customs and the Treasury and others have established. And FTA is working with a myriad of groups to ensure that the freight industry interests are represented, and the officials know what our issues are and what they are in terms of our proposed way of dealing with them. So what can you do? It is to assess at this stage the potential ongoing risks to your business if you're involved in imports and exports, and then the customs issues and the working groups that we've established there, and our interaction with government will be important to you. In our ABC guide to Brexit, we've made clear that the freight and logistics industry is heavily dependent on overseas workers from the EU being involved and what the implications for that are for the freight sector. And of course, market access, the ability to maintain the UK to be able to trade with Europe at low friction costs, as Pauline indicated a minute ago. And there's the opportunity to voice your concerns, as I said, towards FTA and towards government through your involvement. FTA will work on your behalf to identify practical solutions for government. Government hasn't got all the answers, and our members have. So now we can deal with any immediate questions. I don't think we haven't had any questions posted, so hopefully you've been able to get a full appreciation at this stage about where we are with the Brexit process and what FTA is doing and engaging with government to ensure that freight and logistics interests are fully represented. So our next webinars will be on the 18th of May and the 13th of June, as on the slide. You can find out more about what we're doing on the FTA website with the fta.co.uk/Brexit address. And at this stage, I'd like now to thank Pauline for her contribution and thank you for joining in the webinar. And we look forward to engaging with you going forward, because FTA is leading for logistics on Brexit. Thank you for your attention and attendance. Goodbye.